So I'm finding that this is a difficult episode to record because this is an episode about grief. And I am setting myself up for all kinds of difficulty because as I started working on this idea in this episode, what I found is that I didn't need to just do one episode on grief. I've decided to do 8 episodes on grief. So I don't know why I hate myself so much, but here's where I am. No, I'm sorry. I don't hate myself. I think this is so important. I think it's such an important topic that as I've been started working on this, I'm realizing we avoid it so much. So right up front, I want to say we're going to be talking about some challenging topics. We're going to be using some words that might be triggering. Um, grief, as you can imagine, this is hard, but it's so important for us to engage with it. And I realize that in our avoidance and our discomfort with these subjects, we really inhibit our ability to lead our teams well. So it's just so important. So let's get into it. Did a tremendous amount of research as I've been thinking about this throughout all 8 episodes. I'm going to be referring to research. I'm also going to have some resources that I can share through the show notes. One thing that really jumped out at me was that statistically, someone on your team will likely face a major personal loss in the next 12 months. Kind of depends on the size of your team. Kind of depends on the makeup of things, but just in terms of kind of how this broken world works, uh, there's a good chance, unfortunately, that something's going to happen. From UK bereavement research, they found 24% of working age adults in the United Kingdom experience bereavement annually. That's almost 1 in 4. In the US, 1 in 9 employees face the death of a loved one each year. And that's sort of like the worst loss, right? Death of a loved one. But that 1 in 9 figure doesn't include every other event that might cause grief. Things like divorce, serious illness, dealing with cancer and cancer treatments, caregiving crises, mental health struggles. All of these things affect us and affect our work and affect our engagement with the rest of our team. And it's just so likely to come up. 58% of employees have chronic health conditions. And just in terms of stress, 57% of people identify finances as their top stressor. We've got so many things weighing on us that then can move us into grief, that can cause us to experience loss. So this means that, not everybody's going to be operating at 100% all the time. And yet, we tend to plan, and by we, I really mean like organizations, because there is sort of a difference between the business, the organization, and the individual people. Like as a person, if you were to have a conversation with somebody, you would think, well, of course, we're not all at 100% all the time. But often when we do our estimation and our forecasting and our roadmap building, we do kind of make an assumption of 100%. And we might tack on a little bit of space, but for the most part, there's actually pressure to make things seem shorter rather than that they will take longer. Um, we don't really build that in. And so when crisis hits, we're then scrambling reactively instead of having systems ready. So this podcast today and this arc about grief, it's not just about being nice. It's about building anti-fragile teams. Anti-fragile is a term that means that when there is a break, when something impacts the team, it actually becomes stronger. And as leaders, our job is not to try to eliminate human suffering. It's not to just get people to pretend that everything's fine. Our job is to build systems that support people and support the team and the organization so that work can continue and so that people can have the space that they need. And I really want to be clear with the word need there. It's not the space that they want. No one wants for these things to happen. We're not looking to take time off for grief. It's not a thing we have control over. It's just a thing that happens. I debated whether or not to share this, but you know, for me, for a long time, I thought of myself as kind of a professional griever, which I know doesn't really make sense as a term. But I have unfortunately experienced a lot of death in my life. Before the age of 19, I think I had lost about 24 people, right around 2 dozen. And that was to a mix of overdoses, car accidents, suicides, cancer, kidney failure. Um, and I had a fairly rough childhood. Um, and almost died myself on several occasions. So I knew about the stages of grief. I had been to quite a few funerals. Um, I kind of reached a point of thinking, okay, well, if there are stages to grief, if I can just get through them quickly and get out the other side, that's for the best. That's where I need to get. I can just progress through this. I fully engage with grief and I'd be like, okay, this is denial. I'm in denial right now. That means that I have a day, maybe two, to get a bunch of stuff done. So I can set up, to be ready for the sadness and the bargaining and the anger. Like I knew it was going to come, right? And I got really practiced at working my way through the stages. So I accepted that they would happen. What I found in my 30s, um, and I am still, even if just barely, in my 30s, was that I was carrying around a lot of unprocessed grief. When my father called me to tell me that he had cancer, it just really all hit me at once. And, my dad and I, we don't actually have that great a relationship. We're not that close. But the midst of that sort of opened up a lot of other previous events. And I started grieving them. And I was, going to my counselor and I would tell her stories of like, I started thinking about this thing that happened, this person that's gone. And what does this mean? And how do I make it stop? And as you can imagine, she was delightfully unhelpful. There's no way to make these things stop. It's not a thing that we want to experience. It's not a thing we're asking for. It's just a thing that happens. And so, for us as leaders, um, we need to be thinking about the systems that we're building and who those systems serve. The truth is, our work is done by people. There are people involved, no matter your business. And people are going to experience grief. I wish they didn't have to, but we all do. And so we have to build systems that account for that. Here's a few stats that I'll share that also give me a moment to distance myself from the emotions. Um, and I thought some of this was kind of fascinating. And it plays out in product teams everywhere. In the months following a major loss, 85% of workers will experience decisional errors. So, first statement, months. And elsewhere in the research, I find that it often is, on average, about 6 months of kind of deep grief after an event. And during that 6 months, 85% of people will have a major decisional error. For product people, that means that we're going to, miss something major in requirements that's going to push back timelines. We're going to um, miss technical edge cases. We're going to have a communication breakdown. Something's going to fall through the cracks. These things are just going to happen. Um, and while we optimize for 100% capacity utilization because it feels productive, any team operating at that is really brittle. Any plan they have is at a high risk for failure. So the financial impact of this, just in the United States alone, from the Grief Recovery Institute, they estimate that it's $100 billion annually in lost productivity due to grief. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to lose 100 billion every year. It has to do with how we handle the grief, and we don't handle it well right now in our companies. That lack of sort of planning and systematic handling of grief escalates the amount of money that it costs as a result. It's also a big turnover risk. From some workplace bereavement studies, they found 51% of employees who experience loss leave their jobs within 12 months. And people are 56% more likely to leave if they feel unsupported. I suspect the reason for this, because I've seen this happen, is that when we experience a loss, it puts us in a very vulnerable state. And then as we start to move past that, we start to worry about how people perceive us. We worry that they might see us as weaker, or they might remember us in the midst of our grief and in the midst of our tears. We might worry that they look down on us, or they don't trust us, that they think that maybe we're not strong enough for a certain task or job or project. And it also, in many teams, creates an imbalance. Um, if somebody has been, really vulnerable, and it's hard in the midst of grief not to be vulnerable because it can kind of spill over. If other team members have not matched that vulnerability in the past, if other people haven't talked about anything, then there's an imbalance there. And when that type of imbalance occurs, it's more likely for somebody to end up leaving because there's no good way to rectify it. One of sort of the fascinating slash horrifying things that we're finding, in the United States, which is what I predominantly study, the amount of workplace friendships have dramatically declined. People are not as connected as they used to be. And I think this contributes to this imbalance and to people leaving. And, if you haven't heard this elsewhere, turnover is really expensive. There's the opportunity cost while somebody is gone, while a role is empty. But there's also the cost of recruitment, of hiring, of getting somebody trained and brought up to speed. All of that is expensive and hard. The real challenge is that we can't predict when a crisis is going to hit, but we can predict that it will hit. This is sadly unavoidable. It's going to happen. So we need proactive systems, not reactive scrambling. So let me share with you a grief resilient framework. 3 pillars for grief resilient teams that will help your teams weather the storm of major loss and help you take care of your people. The first is to make sure that you're building in organizational slack. Really, you just deliberately maintain some excess capacity in your schedules and your planning and everything. Typically, I recommend about 20%. So, your sprint capacity buffer should be at about 80% of your theoretical maximum. This is why it's important to do things like estimation and velocity measurement, really just so you can manage that maximum and that capacity and make sure that you're planning enough slack. And for the times when there, isn't a loss, great. Now you've got some space for professional development. You've got some space for relationship building. And as we know from Susan Whelan's work, the time that we invest in building trust and relationships then leads to higher throughput and productivity. But then when somebody does have to disappear for a little bit, you've kind of got that built in. What you find is that teams that try to operate at 100% all the time, and I've seen teams that have, done 120% where everybody's working overtime, eventually it breaks and their overall productivity measured over, say like a 6 to 12 month period of time, their overall productivity is less than a team that's running at 80%. It sort of seems counterintuitive. You would think, okay, well, if I'm planning less work, less than 100%, that means that we're leaving money on the table, right? We're not getting as much done. But the truth is that by planning at 80%, you build a sustainable cycle where over the course of a longer period of time, your team produces more. They're more productive, they're healthier, and they're delivering more value than a team that is planned at 100% or more than that. The second pillar is knowledge redundancy. If your team can be doomed to failure just because one person disappears, that's not actually a people problem, that's a systems problem. That's where you haven't planned adequately for business continuity and you haven't kind of invested the time and effort to make sure that knowledge has been shared and everybody's been brought up to speed or that everything's been documented well. So some practical tips for this. First thing I love to do is called a documentation sprint. Schedule these quarterly and invest a couple of weeks in writing or updating run books, API documentation, architecture diagrams, and also have everybody work on a standardized handoff template. I'm going to include an example of this in the show notes that you can download and work with. Should have 7 core sections. First is the job overview. So the person writes kind of what they see as their job and their day to day. Write down the details related to that. Write down their contacts. So who they're regularly needing to connect with, how to connect with that person, whether it's phone number or Slack or email, whatever works for them, and why and what that person does. Their filing system, if they have one. So if, you got to get into their Google Drive, or you got to get into something, have them write down, here's the folders, here's the key things to look for. Their routine activities. I usually think about this as a monthly cycle. It's not per day, because our day-to-day changes. So have people think through their day, their week, their month, and write down what their routine activities are. Any learning resources, just sort of capturing those regularly, maybe the websites that they go to regularly, and their ideas and vision. Write down what they're thinking about and have people take, half a day per quarter to write this type of template. Tremendously valuable for you as a leader and for your business. And then make sure that you're regularly kind of rotating, pairing, and shadowing, cross-pollinating skills. One thing that a recent engineering team I worked with did that I really loved was they had a different person run the release every 2 weeks. That meant that everybody had to make sure that the full stack, every dependency, every library was working for them locally. It meant that they were always familiar with the process. And if somebody was unexpectedly out, during a release day, which did happen, somebody else could pick it up and could run it because they had done it sometime within the last couple of months. The last thing I recommend for the knowledge redundancy pillar is to run what are called bus factor drills. It's a little bit maudlin, but the phrase comes from, if somebody was hit by a bus, what would happen to our business? What would get dropped? So kind of intentionally plan for this. I typically just do it when somebody's on vacation, but I make sure that somebody, I always try to encourage my team members to take significant vacations, like 2 or 3 weeks. And this has two benefits. The obvious first benefit is that person gets a really good break. They're able to disconnect, to decompress, to rest. But the second really valuable part for the business is they get to see what happens when that person's gone, and they've got to deal with it for a while. Um, Typically, there's a period of time during which, if a key person's missing, we can just sort of let it go. And then when they come back, they'll have a huge pile of work waiting for them and they can catch up. And we kind of pile it back on that person, which is kind of a terrible way to handle things. What you instead want to see is what are the things that only they can do so that we can start training other people on those things. Because if they got hit by a bus and they're gone, we have no recourse. So we need to know about that in advance. The third pillar is psychological safety for vulnerability. And I talk about this in almost everything I do. So if you've heard me talk elsewhere, you've heard about psychological safety. But in this context, it really means people need to be able to talk with you when grief strikes. They need to be able to share that. They need to ask for time off. And one of the findings from the research is that only about 30% of employees report that their leadership has ever spoken about grief or bereavement leave. So again, people are going to experience loss 100% of the time. Like 100% of people will experience loss at some point, you know, and it may not be this year, for any given individual, but it is going to happen. So we can be proactive about that. Take some time on a Monday or during a retrospective or something to say, hey, I just want you all to know, uh, if you experience loss, if you're hurting for whatever reason, you matter, your family matters. That's the number one priority. We want you to take the time that you need. Here's our policy. You get this many days for bereavement. Just send me a message. Let me know. We'll take care of it from there. You don't need to worry about work. You don't need to tie up loose ends. You don't need to, sort everything. Just take the time that you need. And by being proactive about building psychological safety, the research shows that teams that have that built in, and that only happens because of you as the leader. When you as the leader build psychological safety for your team and build that environment, there's a 27% reduction in turnover, 76% more engagement with work, which means taking ownership, coming up with great ideas, innovating, and 50% more productivity, all just through creating safety. So you do this by modeling vulnerability, sharing your own experiences, normalizing the conversation. When this happens, it's not an if, but when this happens, when someone on our team faces loss, this is how we're going to respond to it. And know what your policies are. If you know anything about me, you know that there are two ethical systems that guide a lot of my work and how I approach things. So I'm going to share a little bit from both of those perspectives. The first is contractualism. Under contractualism, our actions must be justifiable to reasonable people. So a reasonable person would recognize that people are going to experience loss and we still need to deliver. Like we still need to do the work. We need to give people space to grieve. We should support them. We should model good behavior. Um, all of this seems pretty straightforward, right? So, with that established from the contractualist perspective, your job as a leader becomes shielding your team from external pressure during a crisis. And I've seen this before, and it's frustrating and heartbreaking. You have a key person who loses somebody and they're grieving, and then you've got a VP or somebody in marketing or somebody in sales texting them and saying, "Hey, when is this going to get done?" And they're at a visitation getting messages about work stuff. Like, our job as a leader is to be the firewall, it's to be the shield. And it is difficult um, with sensitive topics like this because sometimes a person doesn't want it shared. They don't want to just tell the whole company, I've just gone through this loss. Now, I mentioned earlier that sort of information imbalance that leads to vulnerability, that leads to people leaving. Like trying to avoid that imbalance is why a lot of people don't share about their grief. And maybe they're willing to share with their teammates, but they don't necessarily want it broadcast. Nevertheless, you as the leader need to intervene and to make sure that they're not getting those kind of messages. And you need to set expectations with the employee to let them know if you get them, just ignore them. There's going to be no fallout. There's going to be no impact on you. I'm going to take care of it. You can forward it to me if you want, or you can just ignore it. And if they complain, then I'll find out and I will take care of it. But you don't need to worry about it. Like that's your job is to be that shield. Um, so, you need to communicate to stakeholders that there's going to be any sort of delays. So, part of what this means is that you need to know who the people on your team are working with, and you need to know who is relying on the people in your team. So, if one person is gone all of a sudden, you need to know that sort of network of projects and relationships and dependencies so that you can then reach out and say, hey, this person's going to be gone. And here's what the impacts will be. These projects will be delayed this long. It's going to impact the roadmap this way, whatever. But your job is to know all that stuff, to kind of know that system of work so that you can protect your person during a crisis. Let's close with a few reflection opportunities for your journaling or just sitting and thinking. The first, if your highest performer had to step away for 6 weeks starting tomorrow, what would break? I think it's good to take time and like write that down. Again, going back to that, knowing that system of work, knowing who's, you know, depending on a person or what projects are going on. Think about anybody in your team, but maybe focus on the person that, you know, if they got hit by a bus, what would be impacted? Second, what's one critical process that only one person on your team really knows how to do? And you may actually have to ask people on the team, but like find out what that one is. Like everything, we don't have to solve every problem immediately. But if you can find one critical process that only one person can do, there's your first step for cross training. And last, how would you explain to your stakeholders that you need to delay a major milestone because someone is grieving? Because remember, this isn't an if, it's a when. This is going to happen. So prepare for it now and prepare in advance and like write it down. Uh, I think sometimes we feel like it's inauthentic if we prepare in advance, if we're not just sort of improving and taking things off the cuff and reacting. We get caught in this trap of like, it's not honest if I prepared. The truth is, you can prepare honestly, it's still you. But think about how you would explain to your stakeholders or your executive team that there's going to be a major delay because somebody's grieving, and just write that down now. Prepare yourself, because then you can go into these situations with confidence. You can make sure you're covering all of your bases and you're covering your team. And that confidence is going to make you look a whole lot better. Looking ahead, I said this is the first in an arc. Building some grief resilient systems is just the foundation. So in the next episode, I'm going to dive deeper into creating psychological safety for difficult conversations, because having that system isn't enough if people don't feel safe using them. And later in the series, we're going to talk about what to do when someone actually faces loss and how to support ongoing grief, and the business case for grief informed leadership. For deeper support, if you came across this because your team is experiencing grief, or individuals are, or you're not quite sure what to do with it and you want some additional help, it's exactly what we do through Fieldway Studio. So check that out at fieldway.org. There's links in the show notes. Always happy to talk and to help about these things. And if all of this is new to you and you've never thought about it before, don't feel like you're behind. That's not abnormal. I think a lot of us avoid engaging with this topic in particular, but by starting, you're creating an environment and a foundation where people can do their best work even during their hardest seasons. Thanks for joining me today.